onwards. Okay, so last time we basically finished with pharmacokinetics. Now we're moving over to pharmacodynamics. So the first time I told you guys that pharmacokinetics is basically just the movement of a drug throughout the body, and now the drug has actually reached an area where it does something. Let me just quickly see if okay, let's use this graph here. So pharmacokinetics was basically the distribution of a drug. So a drug, well, distribution, at absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion, was all of those things combined. That's pharmacokinetics. So but now we are concentrating on that moment when a drug is actually concentrating somewhere. So maybe there, maybe there, maybe there, maybe everywhere. And what will the drug actually do at that site, and how will it actually cause a physiological effect or a pharmacological effect? And then that's what today is about. Pharmacodynamics starts here. Pharmacodynamics might be a bit more difficult to understand. Well, but it really depends on how much effort you put in. Okay, part 1, pharmacokinetics, finished. I hope you guys keep up with the work. Part 2, pharmacodynamics, start. Okay, so initially we start with a drug. We administer a drug. It could have been oral tablets, it could have been an intramuscular injection, could have been a subcutaneous injection, could have been a sublingual tablet that you dissolve under the tongue, could have been a buccal tablet that you dissolve in the, well, you kind of not bite it, but you keep it between your tongue and, not your tongue, your cheek and your teeth, and then it dissolves there and gets absorbed in that area there. That's a buccal tablet. It could have been that. It could have been an inhaled drug, could have been an IV drug, anything. So we basically had absorption happening or administration happening, and then there was absorption, and then after absorption, or after the drug has been moved into the bloodstream or absorbed into the bloodstream, it was spread everywhere, distributed, and after distribution our body slowly got rid of the drug, metabolized it, and then after metabolism we get excretion. Okay, so all of those things are happening at the same time. Kind of, they're happening in the process. So pharmacodynamics fits in when the drug is in the body and the concentration is high enough to give us a response. So pharmacodynamics will continually happen throughout the life cycle of the drug. It's not really a life cycle of the drug, but throughout the time you have the drug available in your bloodstream, or the drug has been distributed within your body. Then we get the pharmacological effect, and that really is pharmacodynamics. So what will the drug actually do to the body? What process will it interfere with? How will it do it? etc. So this is what we are talking about today. So the drug has been distributed, blah blah blah, and now it's at that site of action. So remember the example of a grandpa, the paracetamol and the aspirin and the caffeine got distributed everywhere, but a small portion of it got to the right area where the action is needed. So if you had a toothache, the toothache would be your site of action. If you had a headache, your headache would be a site of action. If you had a muscle injury, that would be the site of action. I hope it's making sense a little bit. Anyways, pharmacodynamics. So, really what pharmacodynamics tries to do is to explain to us what a drug is actually doing, or what pharmacological response a drug is giving us. And we have a lot of different ways of explaining this. And I think we'll hopefully get through all of that in one video, 2 videos, a few videos. Okay. So whenever we ask you in the future about a mechanism of a drug, so the mechanism by which it does something to your body, we are referring to its pharmacodynamic mechanism. What does it do to the body to have an effect? Okay, and we measure this with these effect concentration curves. So what's happening here is, after all the pharmacokinetics, a drug is distributed to certain sites. So at that site, if we have a drug that is at a full agonist, something that activates a process or starts a protest, not a protest, it will give you this amount of effect, like 100% effect at this concentration. So this concentration here, this is the lowest concentration, and this is going higher and higher and higher. So this is a higher concentration. So at this higher concentration, this side, the drug is giving you maximum effect. Well, drug B, the blue one here, is giving you less effect. So we are basically measuring the amount of effect the drug is giving you. So this could be like if I give you a muscle relaxant, it could be the amount that your muscle is relaxing. So if I give you something that causes some muscle relaxation, it gives you this much. If I give you something that gives you more muscle relaxation, it gives you this much. Or if a drug is very potent, I give you a very small concentration and it actually gives you 100% muscle relaxation. And that's the pharmacological effect of the drug. It causes muscle relaxation. And the mechanism we'll go into a little bit more now. But to understand mechanisms, you have to understand the basics of pharmacodynamics. So the basics of how drugs interact in the body. Okay. So all of this can really only be explained with these receptor receptor interactions. So how a drug goes to the receptor and binds to it, or activates it, or antagonizes it, or blocks it off. There's a lot of different words we use to describe the same or different things. But what we really want to focus on in pharmacodynamics is what actually happens at the receptor level. So the drug's been distributed, it went to the site of action, now it's at the receptor. Now it interacts with a receptor and it causes a certain effect. That effect could be muscle relaxation. It could be a very potent drug, and by using a lot of by using very small amounts of drugs, we get a very big response. And all of this, what I want you guys to understand about pharmacokinetics is surrounding receptors. Okay. I'm not sure what this green screen was supposed to do. Oh, it's a video. Wait, hold on. So this is the Parasite Attack. I think this might confuse you guys a little bit too much at the moment. But what happened here is there was a certain signal sent out by one of the immune cells. Okay, wait. Let's explain this whole thing. So, as you can see, these are a bunch of white blood cells here, and this is a small parasite. I'm not exactly sure which one it is, but it's a foreign thing. So as soon as one of these cells recognizes it, it actually creates chemokines and releases chemokines, and those chemokines are distributed throughout this area here. Those chemokines go and bind to receptors on these white blood cells, and then these white blood cells know, but oh my word, there's something here, and then they go and attack this parasite. Quite cool if you think about it. So this was achieved with the chemokines being released from the white blood cells, and those chemokines telling other white blood cells to come and help. So that's also a neurotransmitter or a substance that's released, and that substance binds to a receptor on the white blood cell, and that receptor on the white blood cell activates a process. So if we did this same experiment and we put something in there that completely blocked those receptors, then you won't get this reaction because they won't be able to communicate with one another. If that's making sense, I hope it's making sense. So we are trying to interact with a bunch of different processes in the body to actually achieve different things. In this case here, let's say this parasite was actually good for you. We would want to interact with those receptors that bind to the chemokines and relay the message to all of these white blood cells. So then if we can stop the message from being distributed, we can stop the white blood cells from actually killing the parasite. Okay, it's actually a bad thing, but I'm just trying to give you guys an example. I hope that example is working. Okay. And I just want to... do I want to go in a lot of detail here? Let me just quickly double think if this is actually necessary. Hold on. Definitely not necessary, but it can definitely help. So let's do it. So this slide here, or this entire thing I kind of outlined for you, is how a muscle actually contracts in the body. And there's a bunch of processes that need to happen. And all of these processes are happening as I'm doing this. So how are they happening? How's my brain communicating to my muscles to actually do A, B, and C? And I just highlighted a few of the very important ones here. So there's this thing called acetylcholine. And acetylcholine is released, and acetylcholine binds to the neuromuscular receptors. And as soon as acetylcholine is bound to those receptors open the calcium the calcium ion channels. Let's just call them calcium channels. And when those calcium channels open, it causes an influx of calcium, which makes an action potential, and that action potential propagates through the muscle. And as that action potential is propagating through the muscle, there is physiological changes happening. So there are far more. There's far more to the process than this basic one I'm giving you here. But I want you to understand that we can somewhere interfere with this process. What if we did something that made the acetylcholine unavailable to the muscle, so the acetylcholine isn't even being released into the muscle. Or what if we took that neuromuscular receptor, that receptor on the muscle, and we blocked it off, so acetylcholine can't actually relay its message. So the brain is sending a message to the muscle to contract. But what if we can block that message at the receptor site, so then the message never gets there? What do you think will happen to your muscle? So have you watched Jim Carrey? I think it's Jim Carrey in Pet Detective, Ace Ventura. There were these guys with these blow darts. They shot him. So they shot him with something called curare. And that curare is actually something that blocks acetylcholine from the neuromuscular receptor and causes muscle relaxation. I hope you're understanding the idea so far. So the idea, if we go back all the way, is a drug gets distributed, pharmacokinetics, and then a drug reaches its area of action. And then when it's reached the area of action, it does something to some of the processes. So if it was, for example, a muscle relaxing agent, it could go to the acetylcholine and just inhibit the acetylcholine. If it was something that or it could have been maybe something that blocks the calcium channels in the muscles. If we could block the calcium channels in the muscles, the same thing would happen, because we're blocking the process from continuing. Same idea. Or it could be any one of these processes down here, but I can't remember them that well. I just want to put into perspective how insanely complicated even the simple things are. Okay, so to understand pharmacology a bit better, we have to go into receptors. And you have to, in a sense, also understand the physiology, because what we are basically doing is interfering with the normal physiology to get a pharmacological response. Remember, drugs elicit a physiological change. So they have a pharmacological action that causes a physiological change. Not always the case, but for understanding, let's say yes. Okay. Do I want to talk about... So we have specific receptors on specific parts of our bodies. So when you take caffeine, for example, your heart beats faster. But why do you not, for example, get twitches in all your muscles, but your heart is beating faster? That's maybe a bit of a terrible example. Can I think of a nice example? Oh, okay. When you get a massive fright, you release something called adrenaline. Adrenaline goes through the body and it gets distributed everywhere. So your heart starts beating faster, you kind of become sweaty, you get very pale. There's a lot of things happening all at once, but there's only one thing causing it. So adrenaline is released in the bloodstream and adrenaline goes everywhere. But the areas of the body that reacts to the adrenaline can only react if they have the right receptor to react, or a receptor that reacts with the adrenaline. And those are very specific for specific areas. And that is what we are targeting. So we can target it with various agonists or antagonists. And these receptors you don't necessarily get in all tissues, but they are distributed in the tissues where they are needed in a certain sense. A lot of this will start making sense as we go through it. It's very difficult for me to explain it without some context, but the context will come, I promise you. Okay, so back on still the thing about the adrenaline. So let's go and try and make sense of why your heart beats faster when you have a big fright. So your heart has a certain receptor, a beta 1 receptor or adrenergic receptor, that reacts, or that can be bound to by adrenaline. So as soon as adrenaline binds to that beta 1 receptor, it can elicit effect in the heart. So generally speaking, when you have a big fright, your heart beats faster because it has to pump more blood, so you can get more blood to your muscles, so you can run away from whatever is actually the problem. Well, that's the evolutionary aspect of it. So you only have receptors distributed according to a certain need. We more or less know where most of these receptors are. Well, most of the known ones. There are still many unknown receptors left. And by knowing what receptors we have where, we can also predict what pharmacological action will happen if a drug actually reaches a certain area. Okay. But it's not just as simple as that. So let's let's work only with the receptor, with the adrenaline, and with the heart itself. So adrenaline is also made by us. We have a synthetic adrenaline that's made humanly, made by humans. So we have an adrenaline that we can actually give a person. And the adrenaline we give a person is something that we would call then automatically an agonist. So meaning it causes an effect, it activates, it stimulates. Agonists tend to activate, stimulate, start, and effect. So an agonist needs to first bind to a receptor. And for an agonist to bind to a receptor, it must have affinity for that receptor. So affinity is a neurotransmitter, substance, drug, ETC's ability to go and bind to a receptor. Then for that agonist to activate a receptor, it needs to have intrinsic activity. So if it has 100% intrinsic activity, it goes to the receptor and activates that receptor. If it has zero intrinsic activity for that receptor, it goes to the receptor, and if it has enough affinity, binds to the receptor, and then doesn't cause an effect. But it stays there. This is the agonist, this is the drug I'm talking about, with a lot of affinity but no intrinsic activity. Binds to the receptor and stays there. So now, if another agonist comes or another neurotransmitter comes, it can't actually get past this thing that's just staying there with no intrinsic activity. So this is what we call an antagonist. This would stop other neurotransmitters or other drugs or other substances from coming and binding to the receptor and causing an effect. So it's blocking the receptor off. And I think this is the very basic of it at the moment. Let me just quickly think of what I want to tell you next. Okay, let me just clear the air, or just clear what we've covered in a certain sense. So we've spoken about neurotransmitters and substances, etc., going to receptors, bind to the receptors, and causing effects. Then we said that this binding is dependent on that drug or that substance affinity for that receptor. Then we said that it can only activate the receptor if it has intrinsic activity. And then we said that if it has intrinsic activity and affinity, it can activate the receptor. So we're talking about an agonist here. So an agonist is something that goes to the receptor, binds to it, and activates it. On the other side of the spectrum, we've got something that can bind to the receptor, but it can't activate the receptor. So that is an antagonist. So it doesn't have enough intrinsic activity to activate the receptor, but it blocks off the receptor from activation by other neurotransmitters or other substances. So it's blocking further stimulation. I have a few nice examples about that. I think we'll get there just now. What I quickly want to go into as well. Now I forgot what I wanted to go into. Okay, let's just quickly look at this video. No, restart, it's not playing right. Okay, so you have an agonist here, and the agonist can't bind to this area here. Let's quickly take this and make it applicable to that original example of a muscle contraction. Let's say this is a calcium channel in a cell membrane or in a skeletal muscle cell. And then let's say this calcium channel can only become activated or opened when an agonist goes there and the agonist opens it. So agonist would go bind to this protein here, this receptor, and when it binds to this receptor, it would cause this receptor to open the channel. So then calcium can flow into the cell. And you know, if calcium flows into the cell, you get further activation. So what if I then gave you that curare we spoke about earlier, something like that muscle relaxant, and that curare went and bound right there. So then, as soon as you want to think about a muscle contraction, and in the, you remember in the steps of the muscle contraction, eventually acetylcholine is released, and acetylcholine binds to a neuromuscular receptor. So this could be acetylcholine here. This thing here could be acetylcholine. And then when you add this curare in, the curare is binding to your neuromuscular receptor here. And now that forces your body, even if you're thinking about a muscle contraction and you are getting the acetylcholine to be released in your muscle, you can't get the muscle to contract because the curare is blocking that acetylcholine from telling the muscle, please contract or make a plan. Now it can't make a plan anymore. And then you get complete muscle relaxation, for example. That's just an example. There are 1,000 little other places we can also interfere with. I can't remember exactly what happens in this one. Oh, that's actually a nice one as well. So remember that that pathway, to getting the muscle contracted here, it's not like my brain and my muscle are next to each other. There's a nerve that's connecting my brain to my muscle. So that nerve carries impulses all the way to there. And all along this neuron or that nerve, you get different neurotransmitters being released, and then they activate and the next cell, the next cell, the next cell. So we talk about a nerve, but there's a lot of different neurons in that nerve that actually make that nerve. So when you get an action potential going into one of the neurons, the neuron becomes depolarized. And when a neuron becomes depolarized, like here, it releases neurotransmitters. So these neurotransmitters are what help us keep homeostasis, like I told you guys initially. And these neurotransmitters would go to these receptors here and bind to them. And this is on the next neuron. So then it also causes a depolarization in the next neuron. And this depolarization would cause the same effect in the next neuron. So you'll get another batch of neurotransmitters released, and that will also bind to the next postsynaptic ganglion. So this is a postsynaptic ganglion here, the receptors on the postsynaptic ganglion, and then you get a pharmacological effect. Just quickly run through this one again. So action potential came in, neurotransmitters were released, neurotransmitters went here and bound to the receptors on this cell, and then we got an influx of sodium, or could have been an influx of calcium, and then some physiological change is caused within this muscle here, or within this cell here, and we get calcium may be released from the sacroplasmic reticulum, and that calcium being released from the sacroplasmic reticulum might be actin and myosin muscles to contract over each other. I think this is actually a muscle. Okay, so it makes sense. So there's a massive process involved in. We are interfering with this process somewhere along the line. What if we gave an antagonist there? Then this neuron wouldn't have been able to relay its message here, because all of those messengers, those neurotransmitters, would have been blocked, and the message couldn't have traveled forward. We could have simply stopped it. Or what if we? Oh wait, hold on. So we could block it at that side here. Or what if we gave something that blocked the release of this neurotransmitter here? If this neurotransmitter couldn't be released from this presynaptic ganglion over here, it could never actually reach the receptor as well. So that's another way we could have targeted this pathway and stopped a physiological process from happening. Or we could promote the physiological process. We could force the body to release more of these neurotransmitters. There could be a receptor here, and we could act on that receptor to get more of them released. If we have more of them released, we have a bigger physiological response. Is that making sense so far? If you just quickly go back here to this slide, so you see these little lightning bolts. So if we had antagonists, the antagonists would bind here on all of these receptors, and the antagonist would prohibit this neurotransmitter from actually binding there as well. So if the neurotransmitter can't bind here, you can't get the calcium released from here, and the calcium can't be released, you can't get the physiological response in this actin and myosin, the muscle fibers itself. So we could block it here with an antagonist, and then the neurotransmitter wouldn't be able to bind. Or we could bypass this system and give you an agonist, and the agonist will then cause this response without the body releasing the neurotransmitter. I hope it's making sense. Do you need to know about this? Well, it doesn't really say much. Actually, the only thing it says is it tells you there's a drug and there's a receptor. The drug and the receptor make a complex, and from that complex you get a response. Or there's a drug and antagonist, and you get a drug antagonist complex, and you get no response. So it doesn't really mean much. And this response could be anything. So if you're taking anti-blood pressure tablets, anti-hypertensive tablets, you get a reduction in your blood pressure. That will be your response. If you're taking muscle relaxants, you get a decrease in the tension in the muscles. That could be your response. If you're taking Ritalin, like many of you guys are for studying, your response could be increased concentration and a reward feeling from studying. If you're taking something like alcohol, the response could be intoxication. Intoxication meaning some measurement of euphoria and loss of inhibition, etc, etc, etc. Probably depends on you guys, your person to person. If you took something like, let's think of something a bit nicer. Think of antiviral drugs, so antiretroviral drugs. The response could be a reduction in the amount of viruses being made. So could be inhibiting the virus from growing. That could also be a response. And so forth, and so forth, and so forth. There are 1,000 different examples here. So, we spoke about agonists, antagonists, and we spoke about neurotransmitters and how we can block them from actually doing their job, etc. We also have things called partial agonists, and partial agonists also automatically become partial antagonists. How does that make sense? Let's just go back to this slide quickly. So, let's say all of these are full agonists, so all of these cause a full response. So these are powerful neurotransmitters causing a very big response, a very big physiological effect. What if we gave a person something similar to this that also binds to these receptors before it got released from this presynaptic ganglion, and it only caused partial effect, so it only caused half of the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium here. Then we only get half of the response, but because they are on the receptor, they are blocking this neurotransmitter from causing further effect. Can you think of a place where something like that would be very useful? Can you? So there was this movie called A Street Cat Named Bob. I'm not sure if anyone likes cats. I love cats, so I love that movie. But in that movie, there's a drug addict. He's a heroin addict, and they give him buprenorphine. So heroin is a very potent agonist, meaning it binds to the opioid receptors. The opioid receptors is mu, kappa, and delta. You only do it much later, don't make notes of that now. And then when it's bound to those receptors, it gives you this euphoric feeling, this high feeling. So you can't just get a person on heroin off of heroin. They get these very severe withdrawal symptoms. So there was an initiative they took in the UK whereby they introduced buprenorphine to these extreme addicts. And when they took buprenorphine, they get partial activation, so they don't get withdrawal symptoms, but they can't get another hit. So that even if they go and inject themselves with heroin again, they won't get the full high they got previously. So this way they kept them functioning, and they could slowly get them off of the heroin completely. And even if they relapse and took heroin again, the antagonist of the partial agonist becomes an antagonist because it won't allow the full agonist, heroin, to bind and cause a full effect. I hope everything is making sense to this point. Up to this point, really a lot of basic things have been covered, a lot of very important basic things. We can maybe just go back here quickly. So, let's do the muscle thing again. The muscle is the easiest way for me to explain it because all of you have muscles, all of you can kind of experiment with yourself and look around. In this case, let's say the effect is muscle contraction. So, let's say it could be, let's make it my gripping this highlighter. If I gave you a full agonist, or under normal circumstances, if you release a lot of acetylcholine and that acetylcholine binds to the muscles in your forearm, the muscles would, that receptor will be activated. If that receptor is activated, you get the intraplastic reticulum releasing a lot of calcium. If the calcium is released, the actin, myosin filaments move across from each other or over each other, and you get a muscle contraction. Okay. If I gave you a partial agonist, so let's say you were sleeping and I inject a partial agonist into your muscle here directly. So we're skipping all of the absorption distribution, we're getting it directly into the muscle. Partial agonist meaning it has 50% intrinsic activity. Then your hand can maybe only close halfway. So you only get halfway. Or I give you a complete antagonist. So the antagonist is in here and then you're awake. Now I want to think about it and I want to get acetylcholine. I want to contract this muscle, so my body automatically releases acetylcholine here. But now it can't happen because this antagonist here is preventing acetylcholine from actually binding to the receptor and causing that physiological effect. So now I can't get my hand closed. Baboof babaf. Does it make sense? I hope it makes sense. So I've got examples here of different drugs who all have affinity, who all bind to the receptor, but they have varying degrees of intrinsic activity. So this one only activates the receptor 25%, this one 50%, 75%, and this is a full activation. So this full activation could have been the acetylcholine neurotransmitter as well. Or if it had 0, it would be an antagonist. So it would bind, but it wouldn't cause any effect. 0 effect. Okay. I hope all of this is making sense. I just want to get an idea of how much is left. Oh, there's a lot left. I hope you guys are with me so far. We'll get back into this in a second. Okay, so we went over the basic agonist-antagonist stories now. So now we can go into a bit more detail about other kinds of receptors. But in a certain sense, if you understand the physiology and the biology well, then this would kind of be easy for you. So let's say, for example, that you eat a lot of meat. Oh, I'm starting the wrong way around. Do you remember, I'm not sure if you guys did this, but do you remember that you have something called trypsin in your stomach? And trypsin is responsible for digesting proteins. And do you remember that trypsin is an enzyme? So enzymes are active proteins. Enzymes are proteins doing things in our bodies. Enzymes could split other molecules apart. Enzymes could activate a different physiological response. So enzymes have a lot of different functions in our bodies. So but in this case, we're referring to that that's enzyme trypsin. And trypsin was responsible for breaking down proteins in our bodies before we absorb them. So let's say we could inhibit that trypsin protein. Then we might end up with undigested proteins in our colon. Or what about an enzyme that's responsible for creating a protein that increases blood pressure? What if we inhibited that protein causing that increase in blood pressure? Remember, these enzymes are also created from your genetic makeup, meaning, what I mean by this is, all of the enzymes are proteins, and proteins are created from the idea of the central dogma, meaning you've got DNA gets decoded, and then you get mRNA and tRNA and all of those RNAs. Those ones go and they make functional proteins. These functional proteins could be receptors, they could be enzymes, they could be albumin, bunch of different possibilities what they could be. And then these ones actually have a physiological effect in the body. So enzymes are, in a certain sense, the active version. What a structural one might help a cell react with something else. So a structural one could be something like a cell membrane receptor. Transport carrier proteins, I don't mention anything there really. We have storage receptor proteins, or storage receptors. So remember this slide here. This slide was about noradrenaline or acetylcholine or whatever neurotransmitter being released from here. So a lot of the neurons in the body actually have a receptor on here. That's the storage receptor, and that storage receptor, when activated, could cause the release or it could cause the retention of these neurotransmitters. Let me just quickly see what I had here. So storage receptors, noradrenaline in the terminal synapses of sympathetic. So mostly when we take something like a decongestant agent like ephedrine or pseudoephedrine or one of those, they act on the storage receptors on the sympathetic preganglia. So meaning they cause the massive release of adrenaline and noradrenaline noradrenaline from this area, and that causes an adrenergic response. So more adrenaline release, more adrenaline binding to receptors, more effect. I'm using this slide a lot. I'm just trying to make it general, but actually this is the muscle one, but I'm just trying to make general sense of the work through this slide. It's not like actually everything happens like that. Okay, mentioned. Plasma protein receptors. Well, when we've spoken about these ones, so these are simply the places available on a plasma protein that could be targeted by a drug. So the drug could bind to it, and then the plasma protein could carry the drug away. Remember, for distribution's sake. And remember, if a drug is bound to a plasma protein, it can't actually do its work, and it can't actually be metabolized and excreted. I don't think I want anything else I want to mention here. So, but we get a bunch of different kinds of receptors. I see one missing in here could even be the intracellular receptor. So we get certain receptors that are actually in the organelles within cells, and we even get receptors that are in the genes, meaning in the DNA itself. So an area that might be activated, a genetic area that might be activated, causing more gene expression or more protein synthesis from a certain section in the DNA. So things like testosterone, estrogen, not cholesterol, cortisone, all target intracellular receptors and cause certain genes, the proteins from those genes, to be made more, thereby expressing that gene more. So we get a lot of different kinds of receptors. Most of the times, the receptors that we are talking about are the surface receptors, or the serpentine receptor proteins, which is the transmembrane receptors. Transmembrane receptors could also be the ionotropic receptors or metabotropic receptors, receptors on cells. I've got an example here I'll show you just now. Maybe before I go to this part here, let me show you this video. So, don't judge me. This frog has already been killed. I can't do anything about that. But back in the day when I was a student, this is something they did with us to actually help us understand how certain things react with certain parts of the body, how certain parts of the body have certain receptors that react to certain neurotransmitters or drugs. So, this is a frog that they've dissected. Now they're taking a piece of string, suspend frog's heart outside. There's the frog. You can see as it's putting down on this, and the effect is measured with nothing going on this part. So you have measured heartbeats of this
The
frog
contractions of the
by
heart
this
give rise to a
drawing on the
regular
paper here.
waveform, which is recorded
So
on the chart
now that we have
recorder.
the frog's heart on the outside of the body, we can actually add something. So if you add adrenaline, what do you think will happen on that page there? It'll probably go like this: faster, faster, faster. If you add acetylcholine there, and we'll do acetylcholine later, it's a neurotransmitter in the body, but you don't know it yet, but we'll do it later. If we add acetylcholine in there, the heart contraction will slow. Much, much, much less. If you add a lot of potassium chloride there, what do you think will happen? This entire myocardium of the
It is essential to keep the preparation warm.
this entire myocardium here will become completely hyperpolarized, and then action potentials can't travel through it, so it won't contract anymore. So you will flatline the frog. But yeah, this is an experiment that actually does help you understand pharmacology a lot more. But we've got videos. We can use videos. This frog is already dead, unfortunately, so very cruel way of learning. But let's not let the sacrifice go to vain. Let's use this to understand pharmacology.
Moist at all times during the experiment by dripping physiological salt solution onto the surface of the
heart here. So these cells that have certain receptors will immediately react. Remember, there's no pharmacokinetics involved here because the drug is being injected directly on top of this these cells here with certain receptors. So we get our pharmacological response immediately. And then we can measure the effect that we get.
Drugs can be applied in a similar fashion by dripping solutions directly onto the heart using a Pasteur pipette.
I don't think it's anything else that can actually help you make sense. Oh, don't listen to this. I mean, don't just memorize everything. How I memorize everything, he's probably forgotten half of it already as well. Don't memorize everything. Try and understand it all of it. It works much better. Anyways, back to the slides. Okay, we've discussed all of those, and now we are structure-action relationships. I'll get into this in a second. Okay, the next section, just to make you aware of it, is this structure-action relationship. So basically, we can make small alterations to a molecule, and we can get massive effects from it. And for example, I just put testosterone and estradiol here together. And you can just look around everyday life. There is a massive difference between men and women, and you can actually you can change between the two genders depending on how much you expose yourself to estrogen. So if I expose myself to a lot of estrogen, I would probably start growing breasts and losing some beard maybe. I'll get some more feminine traits. And if you expose a woman to testosterone, you would get more manly traits. So beard, deep voice, all of that happens. So, but just look at how small the difference between these two molecules are. So you've got an extra bond between two carbon atoms here and there, you don't have this methyl group over there, and that's it. Oh, and there's, I can't remember what you call a double bond to O again, but really not a lot of difference here. Not a lot of difference here. And the difference in the effect, if you take the one or the other, is absolutely huge. Absolutely huge. So I want you guys to understand that small changes to a drug molecule can have huge effects. And another thing I want to go into maybe is understanding, a bit more understanding about certain kinds of receptors. So this aromatase, if it says ACE, it's usually an enzyme. This aromatase is actually an enzyme that we find in our bodies. So all men have it. Women also have it, and you have a much higher concentration of it in your ovaries. So women tend to have much less testosterone, and they tend to convert testosterone into estradiol much more effectively and faster. So they don't have a lot of freely circulating testosterone. Men have certain amounts of aromatase in certain parts of the body. I can't actually remember where anymore. But a certain portion of... Oh, hold on, I've got a knock. 2 seconds. So I was at a certain portion. So this is actually very interesting. So a certain portion of men's testosterone, I think it's about 5% or 2%, something like that, gets converted into estrogen. So this especially starts happening to boys at around 16 years old, and then they get these things called stonies, where their nipples are very puffy. So it's actually because they are making estrogen from their testosterone, and they've actually made sufficient amounts of testosterone to start making estrogen for the first time. That's why they have this body change. I don't think a lot of people actually know that. Anyways, so there's this thing, aromatase, this enzyme aromatase, that our body makes. It's made from the DNA, central dogma theory, and then you get DNA, RNA, mRNA, blah 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 blah. Eventually you get a protein. This protein is an enzyme. This enzyme is aromatase. So we have drugs that can actually inhibit this enzyme. So there's a receptor on this drug, and there's a receptor on this enzyme, and we have a drug that can go to this enzyme and inhibit it. And if we inhibit this enzyme, we can prevent the conversion of testosterone to estradiol. So in certain boys, this is actually very nice, because they actually have extremely painful nipples, and that's why we have this drug. Interesting, isn't it? And that's what I wanted to mention there. So structure-action relationships, there is an entire field about this. This is actually very, very complicated. But for you guys, I want you guys to understand that small changes to a drug can have big, big, big effects. Alright, next slide. I think we're actually nearing the end. So this is important, and it's around the importance of selectivity. Why do we want a drug that only acts on a specific receptor instead of 15 different receptors? Because if a drug acts on 15 different receptors, it will cause 15 different effects, where we only actually wanted one effect from one receptor. Just take, for example, quickly, here we have atenolol and propranolol. So if you take atenolol is an antagonist which acts on beta-1 receptors on the heart. So those are the receptors that react with adrenaline. So when it binds those beta-1 receptors, it forces the heart to contract slower. So it's not contracting as fast anymore. But we don't have any beta-2 receptors on the lung here, on the heart here. We've got beta-2 receptors in our lungs. So atenolol is selective for beta-1 only. Propranolol is selective for beta-1 and beta-2. So if a person has, for example, high blood pressure and asthma, and they take atenolol, they should probably be fine. If a person has high blood pressure and asthma and they take propranolol, they would inhibit the beta-2 receptors in the lungs. You know that asthma pump that people take? That thing? That asthma pump actually contains salbutamol, which is a beta-2 agonist. So if we inhibit the beta-2 receptors, we can actually get a bronchospasm where the chest tightens. So selectivity can also dictate what side effects you get. The less selective a drug is, the more likely you get different side effects, or a bigger range of side effects. And this is one example, but think of something like adrenaline as well. Adrenaline isn't specific for just the heart. Adrenaline does all of the adrenergic receptors throughout the body. So there are even adrenergic receptors in your gastrointestinal tract. There are adrenergic receptors in your eyes. If you have a very big fright, your eyes become popped. If there's even adrenergic receptors in your hair follicles, if you get a very big fright, your hair stands straight up, etc, etc, etc. So the less selective a drug is, the more side effects you can expect. And if you know what receptors are where and how a drug actually interacts with those receptors, you can in a certain sense predict what side effects you would get. Where do I want to go with this? Okay, that's finished now. Selectivity, important. We will discuss a bit more about selectivity as we get to certain drugs, especially with the autonomic nervous system, and we guys will still be doing in a lot of detail. What I want to mention about here is physiological and functional antagonism. I just quickly remember here, antagonism comprises two different receptor systems in the same tissue organ, of course. So let's use the heart as an example again. Your heart is innervated or nervated, or it has nerves from both sides of the autonomic nervous system. So the cholinergic system and the sympathetic system, or the parasympathetic system and the sympathetic system. So the one is adrenaline, makes the heart beat faster. The other one makes the heart beat slower. So these are two different receptor systems completely, but they are surrounding the same heart or the same cells. So they have completely opposite effects, and they work on completely different receptor systems. That's why we call them physiological antagonists of one another. They work on completely different receptor systems to achieve completely different results. So it's almost like they're heading in opposite directions. Another example of this is estrogen and progesterone, which are also in a certain sense physiological antagonists of one another. I think the best example I had here is glucagon and insulin. Glucagon makes more glucose, insulin takes the glucose and puts them into cells. This one releases sugar, glucose. This one hides the glucose or stores the glucose. They're doing exactly the opposite thing, working on completely different receptors to do exactly opposite things of one another. Then we have chemical antagonism. There's not really much I want to mention around chemical antagonism. You can think about a chemical doing something in the body. So think about your stomach acid. Think about the hydrogen that's actually lowering the pH in your stomach. And then think about using an antacid, which is like a base that reacts with an acid. So if that happens, you neutralize the stomach acid. So you're chemically antagonizing the effect that you would have had under normal circumstances. Not really much important from there. And then we have antagonists that act, or not necessarily antagonists. Where was my plan with this? Of course, there are drugs that don't interact with receptors at all. They simply mess around with a certain process in the body, or they interfere with a process in the body by some way. So my best example I can think about of this one is the ARVs. Not all ARVs, certain ARVs. So certain ARVs are actually purines, or they resemble nucleosides. And these are the nucleosides that the HIV virus would take and incorporate to make viral DNA. So if we mess around with the HIV virus and we give it false nucleosides and it incorporates false nucleosides into its viral DNA, it fails. So this is what we do. We use false nucleosides to trick it. I hope you guys are seeing there are a lot of possibilities for drugs. Like, it's not as plain straightforward as just receptors, but in a certain sense I want you guys to understand that first before you start thinking about the other possibilities. But there are a bunch of different places where drugs can come into play and cause a physiological response. Pharmacology is around physiological responses, or a physiological response caused by a drug causing it. So if it is by a receptor, or if it is by a changing of a chemical antagonism, or it's by a physiological change caused by a false analog, all of that changes to the body. All of it results in a physiological change. Then we have things called multipotent drugs. Sounds crazy, sounds difficult, not difficult. It just means that this is a drug that can interact with more than just one receptor. So a nice example here is the antihistamines again. Antihistamines can act on muscarinic receptors, histamine receptors, and dopamine receptors. Do I want you to know much more about that? Yes, but with time, not all of it right now. For now, you have to know that it just means it acts on more than one receptor, so it has affinity for more than one receptor. It might actually be that it can agonize one receptor, so causing an agonist effect in one and a completely antagonist effect in the next one. So But we'll get to those specific examples when we get there. Then the phenomenon of tolerance. So the more you take a drug, the more you need to take a drug to actually get the same effect. What's a nice example? Alcohol is a nice example. Anything that gets abused is a nice example. The more you abuse it, the more you need to abuse it to still be happy. Any drug works on this principle. We also have things in the pharmacy like what do you call it, nose spray, oxymetazoline, nafazoline, and xylometazoline. These are all nose sprays that act on a certain receptor in the nose. As soon as you use it for longer than 5 days, you get the opposite effect because you don't actually have the receptor left anymore to give you the effect. Then you get a rebound nasal congestion, but we'll get into that one as well. But tolerance is just, generally speaking, you need more and more and more of a drug to achieve the same effect with time. And tolerance really comes down to up and down regulation. So as your body sees that it is having a big physiological response, it's trying to achieve homeostasis again. And to achieve homeostasis, remember, it wanted to have a certain amount of that response. Let's say you take away that response, or let's say you add to that response, then the body would take away the receptor or add the receptor, upregulate the amount of receptors or downregulate the amount of receptors, because the body is trying to achieve homeostasis again. When you were introducing this pharmacological agent, you changed homeostasis, and your body wants to try and retain homeostasis. So if you take a lot of heroin, for example, your body would start making less and less and less opioid receptors, so it can achieve homeostasis again. And then if you leave it again, if you leave that opioid for a very, very long time, and you don't actually have any endorphins being released, or your lifestyle is just completely gone to shreds by taking so much heroin for so long, then you would eventually get upregulation again. Your body would start making those opioid receptors again. And then with time you probably can get another you can be reintroduced to the drug and have a very big effect, and then you can fall down that cycle again. But I don't really just want to use drug of abuse for example, but we have up and down regulation, making more receptors, making less receptors, because remember, receptors are proteins made by the body or by specific cells. And then we have this thing called tachyphylaxis. Tachyphylaxis is when the stores of certain neurons have been exhausted. So let's say you were taking something that is that acts on a store receptor. So a storage receptor near the end of a presynaptic ganglia that causes the release of adrenaline or noradrenaline or acetylcholine. If you use something that consistently exhaust the stores of the presynaptic ganglia the presynaptic ganglia is the right word, presynaptic neuron, that's actually better. So if you use something that consistently depletes the presynaptic neuron from its neurotransmitters it used to communicate with the next neuron, eventually you get something called tachyphylaxis. And at tachyphylaxis, there's just no more neurotransmitters to be released. You've used so much of these storage receptor agonists or antagonists, these storage receptor drugs acting on the storage receptors, causing the release of neurotransmitters, that there's just nothing more left to release, then you get tachyphylaxis. Then we have things called potentiation and synergism, just meaning two drugs working together to increase each other's effects dramatically. A nice example is paracetamol and tramadol. Both of them work on the nociceptive pathway in pain. If you use one of them, they work, of course, and if you use both of them together, they actually help each other to be more effective. If you use 100 milligrams of tramadol and you add 500 milligrams of paracetamol, that 100 milligrams of tramadol would almost be like taking 200 milligrams of tramadol, because they have a synergistic effect, adding to each other's potency. I think that is basically everything I wanted to mention about pharmacodynamics for just understanding purposes now. When we get to class, I want you guys to really bring questions as well to make it easier to understand. Here is a little slide. I made it in Paint, I think, when I was still younger. So this is just an example of where we get different receptors. So you get receptors inside of the nucleus itself. So this is a certain part of the DNA where you might get a receptor. You get receptors in the cell membrane, these serpentine receptors. When these are activated, they activate a bunch of enzymes inside, and then something happens. The cell does something, depending on what drug it is. And then we have these ion channels. A lot of drugs are working on these ion channels, so causing ion channels to open or close. then action potential happens or doesn't happen. Review understanding quickly. Let's quickly run through this one. Brief notes on various ways which drugs can be transported across cell membranes. This was pharmacokinetics. Outline all processes involved. Okay, we've mentioned it in the last video, I think. Define the term receptor and discuss the factors that govern receptor binding. So a receptor is basically a protein or a structure that can accept a neurotransmitter or a messenger signal and elicit a pharmacological response upon being stimulated. The factors that govern receptor binding really goes down to affinity. So affinity is a neurotransmitter or a drug substance's ability to actually go and bind to the receptor, and intrinsic activity is the ability of that neurotransmitter to actually relay a message to that receptor or activate a response. So a receptor, if we define, I think I've defined it adequately. If you give me such a definition in examination, I would definitely give you marks for it. But the receptor is basically a protein or a binding site where a neurotransmitter or a substance can go and almost in a certain sense deliver a message or activate to elicit a pharmacological response. The next one, explain what is meant by the terms competitive antagonist. So a competitive antagonist is basically just a drug that binds to the receptor, and so it has affinity, it binds to the receptor, but it doesn't have enough intrinsic activity to actually do anything. So it just competes with the neurotransmitters that would have been there under normal circumstances. So it's preventing that receptor from becoming activated by the normal neurotransmitters. So it's just competing against it. Tolerance is the phenomenon by which drugs start to become less and less effective as you use them. It's normally due to up to down regulation, so making less of a receptor until the drug is nowhere to actually bind, so it doesn't have any physiological effect left anymore. Tachyphylaxis is when the stores have become completely emptied out, or the stores have become depleted of neurotransmitters. So this is in the case of a storage receptor activator, or I can't remember what the right term for that is. So, but if you use something like ephedrine or norepinephrine or pseudoephedrine, they act on the storage receptor proteins, and they cause those stores to become emptied or depleted by using them a lot, and then eventually there's nothing left in those stores, and the stores don't actually release the neurotransmitter anymore, and you don't get a physiological effect by taking the drug anymore, and that's tachyphylaxis. Synergism is the phenomenon by which two drugs work way better when they are combined versus using them alone. So they complement each other's physiological response, or they potentiate each other's physiological response. Give in each case an example of a drug that would illustrate your exposition of the above mentioned terms. Well, I can promise you I won't ask you that in the examination. Definitely not. You want to quickly do an example of each? Let's do an example of each. Competitive antagonism, think of something like Atenolol prohibiting adrenaline from binding to beta-1 receptors. Tolerance, think about a person using a lot of heroin and eventually the heroin is not working for them anymore. They've got tolerance against it. Tachyphylaxis, using ephedrine every single day and eventually your noradrenaline stores are completely depleted and you don't get effect when you use noradrenaline again. Synergism, paracetamol, tramadol. Okay, but that's a bit more difficult question, not something I would ask you guys. Illustrate the clinical importance of receptor selectivity by comparing to beta-adrenergic blockers, propranolol, atenolol. So this is the one I explained earlier about asthma and hypertension together. If you use propranolol is a beta-1 and beta-2 selective antagonist. Yes, non-selective antagonist, meaning it acts on both beta receptors. Atenolol is a selective beta-1 receptor antagonist, meaning it only acts on the beta receptors on the heart, not those on the lungs, so they don't cause issues in asthma, where propranolol would cause issues in asthma. And I think we've gone through all of it. Alright, once again, there is that thing, let me just quickly check again. You have what do you call, let's go to the drive quickly. Google Drive, it's somewhere in here. So inside the drive I put that notes for you guys. Where did I put it again? Did I call it nursing? Oh, PHA 2020. Yeah, it must be this one. Oh my word, where is it now? PHA 2020. So use this folder. Use your university email address to log into this or to access this. You won't be able to do it with your own things, your own email addresses. And please don't send me so many invites or requests for invites or something. I don't want to go through every single person's individually. It's just far too much work, unnecessary work. Okay, and then you can access this and you can ask questions, and you can even do this in class, but no one did it in class. Please do it in class. Then I know what you need to know. Know what you need to know. Thanks and bye bye.